Today is October 16, 2025, which is 375 years after the founding of the town of Topsfield, which was October 16, 1650. On the 1906 photograph that's behind me, we see the town hall and the Congregational Church, as well as some stables for the horses to be boarded while the people visited these buildings. It's a symbolic photograph because both the church and the town represented a fusion between church and state, which was the way the colony was administered back in the 16 and 1700s. In fact, most of the town business was done in the meeting house, and that's why it was called the meeting house. And they would hold all the town meetings there. The town would also vote to raise the money to sustain not only the minister, but also the upkeep of the buildings. It was a function of the town to contribute and maintain the meeting house. So religion played a great part in the founding of Topsfield, as well as other towns in the region. When the government from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, when the Bay Colony Board of Governors granted the charter for the town of Topsfield in 1650, it required that within a short period of time that the town establish a congregation and hire a minister to administer to the needs of the congregation. Every town in that era had that same requirement. Church, you can form a town, but you must have a congregation and a minister. Who were these people who created the town and founded the town? They were Puritans. They were people who wanted to purify the religion of England. And so they brought their religion with them to Massachusetts to establish a new commonwealth for the worship of God and to fulfill their ideals of what ought to be a God-filled colony. So they set out in 1630 with an event called the Great Migration. The Great Migration of 1630 began in March when Governor John Winthrop, who held the charter for the new colony, was able to gather together 700 people to sail from England, to leave their homes and come to Massachusetts to establish this new city upon the hill. He was able to assemble a consort of 4 ships right away, and that would be the Arbella, which was the main ship. It carried Lady Arbella, it carried John Winthrop Sr., the governor, and it carried his youngest son, Henry. The Arbella was flanked by the vice admiral's ship, which was known as the Talbot, and also flanked by the rear admiral's ship, which was known as the Ambrose, and finally the captain's ship was known as the Jewel. So they had 4 ships. They sailed from London. They went down the Thames River very slowly because these are square-rigged sail ships. They had to sail with the wind. It was impossible to sail against the wind without tacking to and fro, which meant progress was very slow if you were going against the wind. So it took them a couple of weeks to get down below below Great Britain by the Isle of Wight. And there they were becalmed for 2 more weeks until April 8th. They were becalmed there because there was a a gale that was blowing against them, and they couldn't sail into it. They had to wait for the winds to shift so they could sail out into the Atlantic. And then they did on April 8th, 1630. They went out into the Atlantic on a ship like this, and the ships were called sweet ships. Sweet, S-W-E-E-T, sweet ships. They were ships that were originally built for the wine trade. Wine, W-I-N-E. And they would sail to the Mediterranean, pick up loads of wine, bring it back to England or France, but mostly England, where they would discharge their cargo. They were ships that were especially seaworthy and very tightly caulked, and so they were always dry. And in their holds, they had to support what they called planters, which were the people coming from England to New England. Planters, they were the immigrants, they were the planters. And they were below deck. All the ship's crew were up on the decks. Mostly the crew was on the forecastle, and the officers were on the high poop deck. The passengers who came over, they had to be below decks, and so they built rude cabins for the women and children made out of plank boards. And the men, they put on hammocks, and they suspended them between wherever they could. And there would be anywhere from 50 to 100 people on each ship, plus chickens, pigs, and cows. And this is the condition they would be in for 2 months. They were sailing from England to Massachusetts, and sometimes it would take them roughly 2 months to do that. Imagine that, the stench that must have been in that ship, as well as crossing the Atlantic. And the Atlantic in that time of year, as you can imagine, is cold. It's quite cold. In fact, people would get seasick, and the governor, Winthrop, who kept a journal of the trip, said that he would call the passengers up on deck. He would suspend a large rope from the front of the ship to the rear of the ship, and he would make them move that. He would make them shake that rope up and down and sway it up and to and fro, because he wanted them to get warm, and by getting warm, they would become less seasick and have a greater endurance, greater stamina. So there they were, April 8th, they set out across the great Atlantic, and during the process, they were able to stay pretty much together until approximately 2 weeks later, they ran into a gale, and the Talbot, which was the second in command ship, got separated at night, and they couldn't see it, they couldn't find it, and they never saw it again until they landed in Salem. So across the Atlantic they went, and on June 8th, they sighted the headlands of Mount Desert in Maine. And as Winthrop said, the day was clear, the sky was blue, the clouds were white, and what they really exhilarated in was the smell of the land that reminded them of a sweet garden in England. And so they sailed down the coast of Maine, past the hills of Camden. They got out by the Isle of Shoals off New Hampshire. They got as far as Cape Ann, where they had to stay for a couple of days because of a southwest gale that was blowing, so they couldn't go any farther south. Then the gale relented, and they were able to come around the Cape and they sailed down to Marblehead and camped, and they were able to drop anchor in Salem Harbor. And Winthrop got off the ship with Lady Arbella. They were hosted by Governor Endicott in Salem. And when they asked to have a child baptized, a child that was born on the trip, the ministers of Salem said, well, because the child is not a member of the congregation, we will not baptize the child. At that point, Governor Winthrop got his people back on their ships, and they left Salem indignantly, in a huff, and they went down to Boston. And there they dropped anchor and they went into Boston and settled there. Charlestown, Boston, they went up the river, some went to Woburn, but most were in Boston. And so from 1630 on, Governor Winthrop was the governor, and he administered the colony, but he was kind of anxious about the French and the Indians, and knowing that the town of Ipswich, or the land of Ipswich, had been vacated by the Indians because of disease, and primarily because of disease, there were large open fields that were available for planting, and there was a good harbor. So he asked his son, John Winthrop Jr., to gather 12 families and have them settle the lands of Ipswich, which they did in 1634. So up they went to Ipswich, and they began to settle that village, plant their corn. The fishing was incredible. Apparently you could just wade in the water and pick out lobsters. They also discovered that the Indians had been going there for thousands of years, and there were shell middens, which are mounds of shells that were 15 to 20 feet high. They were just all over the place. I would imagine Crane Beach, if you were able to go there in that time, there were mounds of shells that surpassed your height by two times. At any rate, so in 1634, the families were there. More families came and began to settle there, and they began to venture inland. They went up the river. They went up following the ancient Indian trail along the banks of the Ipswich River, going inland. And they went to a place that was known by the Indians as Shenawemity, which means a pleasant place of flowing waters. A pleasant place of flowing waters. And so they followed that path up until they got to Perkins Row. Perkins Row is so named because of the number of families named Perkins who lived on that road. And so they settled there. They settled primarily there because behind them was a hill. It's called Great Hill. And so it was a lot easier to settle by Mile Brook and by the Ipswich River. And so they did, and that was considered the center of town back in the 1640s. They actually built a very rude meeting house, a church, and they worshiped there. And then finally, continuing their quest to go inland, they went up and over the road called Howlett Street, which was called the Old Road. They went up over the shoulder of Great Hill and came to what they call the Plains, which is this area right here in town, where the town hall is, where the Congregational Church is. This was considered at once called the Plains because it was flat. This picture behind me, this photograph or this painting, shows the landing of the Winthrop's fleet in Salem in 1630. People disembarking. When they landed there, Masconomet came over from Topsfield, and he visited the ships to see what he could take, and he made his acquaintance known to Governor Winthrop. And in fact, in 1638, 8 years after Winthrop had landed, and having met Masconomet, they agreed to, Masconomet agreed that he would sell the land that he was from the Merrimack River to the Chabaco River off the Bay of Agawam. He would sell that to Winthrop and the colonists for 20 pounds. And he did. He signed a deed. And that deed remained in the family, the Winthrop family, until 1899, when that deed was donated to the Essex Institute in Salem. Masconomet, and this is his grave, his headstone. He died in 1658, and he's buried on top of Sagamore Hill. But after he died in 1658, 50 years later, in Ipswich, a couple of boys dug up his grave, detached his skull from a skeleton, and they went into town throwing the skull back and forth to each other like a ball. And that caused great concern to the residents who saw that. And so they stopped that activity. They exhumed Masconomet, reattached his skull to his body, got his wife out of the ground at the same time, and they reburied them on top of Sagamore Hill in Hamilton. And this grave is from Sagamore Hill in Hamilton. In 1643, 13 years after Winthrop came over, he led 700 people here. It was the first settlement of sober, middle-aged people experienced in farming and in other trades to settle in the New World. Up until that time, all they were adventurers who were looking to seek a fortune in fur or whatever, and fishermen, like out at Gloucester or up in Portsmouth. And so in 1643, the original 700 people had swelled to over 16,000. But as you can see from this map, there's no Topsfield. There's Ipswich. There's no Middleton. There's no Peabody. There's no Newburyport. And Raleigh goes all the way from the Atlantic, all the way inland up to the Merrimack River. But in these communities, and including Boston, which isn't shown here, at least 16,000 people had settled in the new colony. It was quite an achievement. Here the Indian lands are shown, and I take this from Sidney Purley, who did this map, and it shows that pretty much where we are was occupied by the Agawam, and south of us, down around Lynn and Salem, were the Nomkeg. And above on the other side of the Merrimack River were the Pentucket Indians. So Masconomet basically had the domain over this part of the area that's marked with all these, the shaded area. In the 1640s, this area was known as the New Meadows. And it was referred to the New Meadows in legislation that was enacted in the Great and General Court in Boston. But by 1650, Topsfield had acquired enough residents and farmers and whatnot to petition the Great and General Court for a charter, for a corporate charter to be established as a separate residence from the town of Ipswich. And the lieutenant governor, a man by the name of Samuel Simmons, he lived in Topsfield before he came over here in 1632. too. And his place was known as the Olivers. And this is a picture of the Olivers as it now exists in the town of Topsfield, England. And that's where the lieutenant governor raised his family and lived until he moved here. So he had a fondness for the town of Topsfield, England. And instead of the town being incorporated as New Meadows, he was able, in the legislation, to change the name to Topsfield. And that's how we got to be known as Topsfield. Topsfield was originally in a settlement in Great Britain, named after a Saxon by the name of Tops, or Topus. This is the church in Topsfield, St. Margaret's. This is where Simmons had all his children baptized. It's quite old. Another view of Topsfield. It shows a typical house. Topsfield, even today, is sparsely populated. It's in a kind of like a remote area in the central part of England. It's close by Ipswich. It's flanked by Ipswich, Sudbury, Chelmsford, and Haverhill. And also not too far from it is also Boxford. But even today, the population is, I believe it's under 2,000. It's about 1,800. As a personal anecdote, I have to tell you that a few years ago, I was leaving service at the Congregational Church and went to get to my car, which was parked at the church parking lot, at the town hall parking lot. As I was about to get in my car, another car came beside me, parked, and the people got out and inquired of me, and they asked me, "Is this Topsfield?" And I said, "Yes." "Where are you from?" And they said, "We're from Topsfield, England." Well, I proceeded to take them under my wing and bring them into the church, show them the Parson Capon house, and they were all very impressed with the appearance of town and the hospitality I showed them. And they sent me, when they got back to England, they sent me pictures of their farm, which was a 1,500 acre farm. I think they were the largest landowners in Topsfield. Their farmhouse was an early 1700s farmhouse. Their main barn was built in 1465, and it is registered in England as one of the, as an old structure. It has a certain classification, and it has that old structure classification. So, when the town folk came over over Great Hill to settle in this part of the Topsfield, there also occurred a development of 16 families who had bought land from Joseph Jewett in Rowley. They settled in an area called Rowley Village, which now is known as Boxford. Rowley Village was not located in West Boxford, but in East Boxford by the road that leads from our town commons over to Boxford. So Jack's, or that part of Boxford where the Historical Society is located. That's where they primarily were located. And they began to experience difficulty in attending the church in Rowley, which was anywhere from 7 to 9 miles away. Going to church was an all-day affair. They would get the family together, they would go to church, they would sit there in the morning for about 3 hours and listen to prayer, meetings, hymns. They would break for dinner, and then they would go back to church for another 2 or 3 hours. Basically, it was an all-day affair. So these people in Rowley Village found it very difficult, very inconvenient to travel from their home, from their farm, all the way 9 miles out to Rowley, the actual town of Rowley. So what they did was they aligned themselves with the people here in Topsfield who belong to the Congregational Church. And they said, we would like to come to your church and worship with you. In fact, we would like to have our militia also train with you on your training fields. So between the militia and the worshipers, the villagers from Rowley joined hands with those people who lived here in Topsfield. And they asked to join with us if in worship services if we would move our meeting house from Howlett Street to somewhere more convenient and closer to them. And so the meeting house was moved to the southeast corner of the cemetery, of Pine Grove Cemetery. And that was done in 1663. The meeting house was built for the convenience of the 16 families who came from Boxford, from Raleigh Village. They agreed to contribute money to the town for the construction of the meeting house, and they did. And they worshiped there. And in 1632, Robert Smith came over. He was only 14 years of age. He came over from England, north of where Topsfield is, north of Boxford. And when he was 38 years old, he got married to a French girl, a girl named French, which I assume was from the French family that lives out there by the turnpike, and that beautiful French house that's on Howlett Street. But he was part of those who petitioned the court, the general court, in the 1660s to establish a church where they could be free from their financial requirements from the town of Rowley and join with the Topsfield Church. And the court granted them permission to do so. They said, if you and Topsfield agree that you want to join their church and join their militia, by all means, if that's what you want to do, we'll sanction it. And they did that. Robert Smith was the first ancestor in this country of Joseph Smith, who eventually founded the Mormon religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints. So they built that church, and when King Philip's War began in 1675, the town authorized and built what they called a watch house, which was a 10-foot square building to maintain an outpost for the defense of the town of Topsfield. And around the church and the watch house, they put up a stone wall, which was 5 feet high and 3 feet thick, as additional protection. So it's my theory that they moved the meeting house and set it up in that location by the cemetery because that was then considered the center of town. The church is basically where the center of town is. Out there they had the Hovey family, the chief of police, a direct descendant of the Hoveys. They had the Howe family, the Purley family. They had some Goulds out there. And they were out there by what we call Hood's Pond. And that was called Ipswich Farms at the time. So those families lived out there. It was the meeting house was located not only convenient for the people in Boxford, but also for the churchgoers who lived out in that part of Topsfield. It made sense because if you went down Ipswich Road, which was right by there, you went down to the grist mill. Peabody had a grist mill at the foot of Ipswich Road where it met the Route 1, the Newburyport Turnpike. So that situation existed for that period of time, and we got into the hiring of Parson Joseph Capon in the 1670s. And in 1683, having come through the Indian Wars and still mindful of the threat they were posed by the Indians, Capon built this house, which is basically a fortified garrison. It's a garrison house. It's got the overhang. It's got a third-story overhang. It overhangs on the second floor over the first, and the third floor overhangs the second. And between the outer boards and the inner wall are bricks. Bricks. So it was a fortified garrison, in addition being the parsonage house. It sat on 12 acres on a slight knoll given to Parson Capon by the town, but it's considered one of the finest examples of 1600s architecture in the United States. Parson Capon was here when the witch trials, when the witch hysteria began. It all began in the 1680s. Actually, it had begun off and on since about 1640, but in the 1680s, there were some prosecution and execution of witches down in Hartford, Connecticut, Hartford. And in the 1680s, it began around here, up in that part of Topsfield called Ipswich Farms, out by Hood's Pond. And that's where Elizabeth Howe lived. And without going into detail of all the people that were affected, I'll just focus on the Howes. They lived next door to Samuel and Ruth Purley, whose daughter, Hannah, was taken with fits, and she wasted away to skin and bones and eventually died 3 years later in 1686. And the Howes attributed her demise and her worsening condition to good wife Elizabeth Howe, Goody Howe. And so there was a disagreement between the neighbors. Another neighbor by the name of Nathaniel Purley and his wife, they had a young daughter, 10-year-old daughter named Patience. And while she became sick, they also suspected Goody Howe of being the instigator. And Goody Howe denied this and said, "I'm not a witch, and I don't go back and forth invisibly through walls. I'm just a housewife." And Patience did recover, but Nathaniel Howe had some cattle that wouldn't give any milk, or if they gave milk, it was instead of being gallons, it would be a quart. And so he said, my cattle are affected. There's a spell that's going on. And Elizabeth Howe was accused of having an evil hand. Her brother-in-law accused her of causing the death of Hannah Purley. And the only person who testified in her favor at the trial was her father-in-law. And eventually, Elizabeth Howe, like other women in this area, Sarah Cloyce, Rebecca Nurse from Danvers, Sarah Wiles, Mary Esty. On July 19th, in 1692, they were convicted. They were hanged. They were tried as witches. They were found guilty. They were found guilty by reason of the use of what we call spectral evidence. And that evidence is that which nobody can see except the person who's making a claim of being afflicted. And we all know the stories of the girls from Salem Village out in Danvers who would scream and writhe around on the floor or fall down or claim that to have been pinched or pricked or stabbed or hit by the invisible hand of the so-called witches. The main minister of the colony, Increase Mather, he was over in England negotiating for a new contract, for a new charter for the colony. So he wasn't here. So in his absence, in the absence of a charter, this hysteria grew and culminated in 1692 with the execution of many people. And on July 19th in 1692, these 5 women were executed. They're all hanged at Gallows Hill. It was an unfortunate and lasting tragedy that echoed down for nearly over 200 years before it was finally before the crimes were finally exonerated by the legislature in Boston, and the stigma of being a witch was removed. When Sarah Good was found guilty of being a witch, she was led to the gallows on Gallows Hill. As she had the noose around her neck, below her stood the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, Noyes. And he implored her to finally confess to being a witch. And she was perturbed by this request. And so she said, you are a liar, she said. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you proceed to hang me, then God shall give you blood to drink. About 50 years later, Nicholas Noyes, on his deathbed, choked to death on his own blood, which was pouring from his mouth. So her words came back to fulfill her prophecy, her taunt. But at any rate, that was an incredible circumstance that occurred. Gallows Hill, as you can see, before the North River was filled in, it went way inland. And when Rebecca Nurse was hanged, her sons and her body was stuffed in the rocks that were by the gallows. Her sons were determined that she was not going to be humiliated in death by an open burial. And so they surreptitiously, without notice and without telling anybody, they rowed all the way down the Danvers River and up the North River, where they went and they got their mother's body and brought it back in the boat, rowed it quietly. This was at night, rowed quietly back up the Danvers River and brought it to the homestead where she was buried. So after the witchcraft hysteria passed, the town, the region, New England began to quiet down. Increase Mather had returned. He had brought a new charter with him. So there was an order again in the government, in the governance of the colony, not only secular, but also on the religious side. and the town turned finally to matters that had been deferred, but now rose to the front to be addressed. And the first of these was a request by the grandsons of Masconomet. Their name was English. And they came to the town. They went to every town in Essex County. And they said, look, our grandfather sold the land to you for 20 pounds sterling. We don't think that was enough money. And we don't think the deed was any good. Well, the towns appointed a committee to deal with these Indian claims. And so they did. And they, in the town of Topsfield, which was one of the last towns that settled with the grandsons, the town authorized the sum of £3 to be paid to the English grandsons, or to the grandsons named English. And so in 1701, the grandsons signed a new deed giving the town all of the land that it occupies, and for which they were paid £3. And that settled that claim, an Indian claim to the land, forever. It was a release deed of whatever Masconomet had conveyed. We released any and all right for ourselves and everybody else to that land. And so Topsfield solidified its title to all of the lands in its jurisdiction. That was in 1701. In 1703, the town decided it was time for a new meeting house. The old one, which was constructed in 1663, had reached the end of its useful life. So they sold the farm, they sold the building out there on the cemetery to a Captain Gould, G-O-U-L-D, a famous name in Topsfield. And he moved the meeting house down to that part of Topsfield known as Springville, which is down by the Country Motors, down on Ipswich Road. Springville was named after the numerous springs in the area, and that's where the Peabody grist mill was located, running off the waters from Pye Brook. And the building was used as a barn in a field. We don't know what happened to that, but that's where it was relocated to. And so the town decided they would put a meeting house now on the West Common, where the current 1842 meeting house is located. So now this is the third meeting house. The first being over by Howlett Street, the second at the cemetery, and the third, fourth, and fifth meeting houses are now on the West Common. The third one was built in 1703. But first the town had to deal with what is known as the Sugar Loaf, which is this is at the corner of Grove Street and Washington Street. This is a sugar loaf. And all it is an eruption of stone from the surrounding area. It was knocked down and leveled. And the meeting house, the third meeting house, was built on its spot. So was the fourth. The fourth was built on top of the third foundation. And the fifth meeting house in 1842 was built on top of the fourth foundation. I'm going to come back to the Smiths. Robert Smith was instrumental in moving the first meeting in the town, eliminating the first meeting house and building a second meeting house closer to Boxford at the Pine Grove Cemetery. His son, Samuel I, was hired by the town on numerous occasions to make repairs to the meeting house, but also to supply oak planks for bridges. His son, Samuel II, was known as Captain Smith. He was captain of the militia. He was our representative during the Revolutionary War to the various committees of safety, not only the local but also the colony-wide committee of safety that was ruled by Hancock. The Smiths were very patriotic. They served a number of important functions in town. They were selectmen, they were town clerks. But Captain Smith was also our representative to the war, during the war, to the councils. And he agreed to be paid in continentals, which was cash money, paper money, issued by the colony. His farm, which was out there off Ipswich Road on Boardman Lane, was eventually unworkable because Samuel Smith died only a few years after the war ended, and he owed money to the town of Topsfield. His money that he accepted for his services became worthless. They were known as worthless continentals. So he became bankrupt. He died of probably heartbreak. At any rate, his son, Azel, came down from New Hampshire. He was up around Derryfield, and he came down and he came down with his son, who was Joseph Smith Sr. They were all members of the Congregational Church, every one of them, from Robert to Joseph Smith Sr. And they worked the farm, they paid off the debt, and they left town. They finally moved up and they went back to New Hampshire. Actually, they went to Vermont, and they removed from town in 1790. It was during Washington's first term. So basically from 1650 to 1790, they were here for 140 years. Actually from 1640 to 1790, about 150 years. And there's an interesting story that was published in the Salem Gazette in 1886, whereby a group of Topsfield residents went over to Topsfield, England, to visit it. And at the lodge where they were staying, they were told by one of the housekeepers that, somebody had already been out here to inquire about the graves of their ancestors. And they said, so the guests, they asked, well, who was it? Was it a Gould? No. Was it a Cleveland? No. Was it a Perkins? No. Was it a Bradstreet? Oh, no. And then the wife of the innkeeper came out from the kitchen and she said, oh, I know who you're talking about. It was that man who had the 6 wives. It was Joseph Smith, it was. Well, that was 1886. I don't know if it was Joseph Smith Jr., the founder, because he died in 1844. But his son was Joseph Smith III, I would imagine, and he lived to be quite old. He was into his 90s. He died in, I believe, 1919. I suspect it was him that had gone over to England, to Topsfield, and not his father. But in a way, the Smiths, while instrumental in helping guide our town through the Revolutionary War, maintaining a farm, and coming from the town of Topsfield to eventually create a new Christian religion known as the Church of Latter-day Saints, or they, in 1874, George Smith, the historian of the LDS, of the Mormons, he had a red monument erected to the Smiths who came from Topsfield. In 1889, the Topsfield Historical Society was formed, and it included several members of the Smith family from afar. They had the president of the Smith family, who was listed as a member. This information is found in the library. You can go look it up in the collections, in that 30-volume set published by the Topsfield Historical Society. But there was a George Smith. There was another Smith who was the president, and finally there was another Smith who was a descendant of Azel, who was the grandfather of Joseph Smith, and he was from Lamoni, Iowa. So if it wasn't Salt Lake City, it was Lamoni, Iowa, because Joseph Smith III, well, he thought he was the direct successor to his father. There was a division in the Mormon religion. Most of them went with Brigham Young out to eventually Utah, while others remained in Lamoni, Iowa, which is the headquarters of the community church, as it's now known. It used to be known as the Reformed Church of Latter-day Saints. But in a way, they haven't left, because in 2022, the Mormons came out from Utah, including the president, and they dedicated this memorial, which is in the southeast corner, this Smith family memorial, which is located in the southeast corner of Pine Grove Cemetery, essentially the same location where Robert Smith prevailed upon the town to locate the second meeting house of the Congregational Church. So that's the first 75 years of Topsfield wrapped up in a nutshell. I hope you learned something, and if you'd like to read more, this manuscript, called The First 75 Years of the Town of Topsfield, is in the library. It's in the general circulation section, and it's also found in the Topsfield reference room. And you can read all about this and more in this manuscript. I appreciate it. I'm glad you were able to listen to this. My name is John Kinnan. I'm going to sign off now, and I wish the town happy anniversary.